Let's talk about classes in VBScript. So a class is just a way to group together specific concepts and data. It's a blueprint, so to speak, of an object. And for an example, say we had a person that we wanted to represent. Normally we would create variables for each of that person's things. For example, their age and name. And then we could assign those things. Say this is for Jake and his age, right? But then we come along and we need another person and we want them to have the same attributes or data that this other person does. So, okay, maybe we call this person 2 name and person 2 age. And then, I don't know, change this to person 1. We need also this person to be able to do things, right? Maybe it's a game and we need to update their age. So we would create a function for that. So sub birthday or something. But we would just need to update this person's age or someone else's age in here. So we'd have to pass in basically the person's age that you're trying to update, or you would have to create, person 1 birthday and then create a function that just updates person 2's birthday. And you can see this just gets very repetitive and it's a bit hard to keep track of because you're the one that has to assign these variables and keep them consistent. Another problem is that this variable and this variable aren't actually related to each other in any way. I mean, we've named them very similar, so they seem like they're related, but there is no link between the two, so it's very easy to mess up the grouping and stuff of data. So that's what we're going to solve today. Is we're going to create a variable that can store this and this inside of it, as well as any functions and stuff we need to be able to update that specific person. So how do we do that? All right, well, it's done with a class. So you just call class and you'll give the class a name here and then you'll end the class. So what do we want to call this? Well, in this example, I'm representing a person. And in that person, I want to have the name of the person and the age of the person, for example. Now, inside a class, we don't use the dim command. We actually use either public or private. Let's start off with them being public, and then I'll give an example of them being private. All right, so I've created kind of this blueprint where it has a name and age in it, and now I want to use it. I want to create a new person and use it. So we do that with the new keyword. So we'll do, dim person1, just kind of how we did up here, but instead of having to create 2 variables called age and name, we'll just create 1. And then we'll assign it to be a new person. So we would do person1 equals new person, or whatever this class name is called, right? Whatever you call this, you just create a new version of that. Now, because this is an object, you have to use the word set, because this person variable is not pointing to one thing, it's actually pointing to a set of things, a bunch of things that you can access. So we're going to use the word set, otherwise you'd get an error. This is very similar, by the way, when we use the create object. It's the same thing. We have to use set because we're creating an object. This is a blueprint for an object. And when we create that object, it represents multiple things. So again, new person. Okay, so now we have a person. And again, we have a name and age on these guys. So if I were to do person1 dot name, we use the dot syntax to access things, to access public things within inside of our class. And now I can assign this just like I did before, age 23. But notice the difference is this name and this age belong to person1. Up here, they didn't belong to person1. They were 2 separate things, and we were just naming them in a way that grouped them together. But now they're actually a part of person1. So when I do message box, I can get person1's name, like so. Or I can get person1's age separately, like so. You can see right here, print out Jake and print out 23. So that's a big win already, as we don't have to do this type syntax. So let's go ahead and remove that. And when I want a second person, I'll just copy all this and call it person2 right here, or whatever you wanted to call it. If you wanted to give it a very specific name, this will be for Lily, for example. We'll make her 3422. So that's all we have to do. We create a new person, assign it to a variable, and now we can access that person's items. Okay, well, what's the benefit of this besides just having this nice grouping and being able to create new variables? Like, say we created these name and this age variable automatically, and we're able to assign it. But what's the benefit of some of that? Well, some of the main benefits are, well, besides keeping things consistent, we can also restrict how we assign the name or how we get the name or age. So for example, you wouldn't want to be able to come down here and say -15. That doesn't make sense to put on an age. Before, when we just had person1 age, we could do that. And even now we can do that now, but I want to restrict that behavior. So let's do that. We do that by making these private so that we can no longer touch them. So I'll make both of these private, and let me just save this and notice when I run this right away, I get an error. And the error says this object, which is my person, doesn't support the property or method called name, because we're trying to access the name here and assign it. And if we kept going, we'd get an error for age as well as for these items down here. So because they're private, we can't access them anymore outside. We can't assign them. We can't even message box them out if we wanted to. And I did that because, again, we want to put a restriction on this. So the first restriction would be on the age. I don't want to be able to assign negative numbers, and probably should put a restriction on how large it can be as well. So we do that by creating what's called a property. So this will be public, and it's called property. And there's a couple different properties. You can either have a get property, which gets information, or you can have a let property, which sets information. There's also a set property for dealing with just objects. We'll get into that a bit later. So let's start with being able to get this person's name. So before, let's just move this down here and do a message box. We'll do a message box before and after, for example. So again, this would error. Let's get the item's name. So we'll do get, and we'll call this name, and we'll do end property. So in here, we want to return the person's name. So we'll say, okay, the name equals name. Well, we can't do that because these two are called the same. So we will have to change these names now. Otherwise, you'll see we'll get name redefined. And unfortunately with VBScript, lowercase, uppercase mean the same thing, so you couldn't just do this. And so most people, the common syntax is to just put m underscore, m standing for member of the class. If you wanted to, you could call it whatever you wanted though. You could say internal name, or you could say this name, right? Anything you want. I'll stick with the general convention, which is to use m and do that. All right, so what are we doing? We're creating basically a method is what this really is to get the name for us. We need to create one for the age to be able to get the age. Again, we'll call it age. You could call this get name and stuff like that, but generally your properties are just named as your variables would be, but you use an uppercase. Again, this will have to be different though. All right, so now our message box will return successfully for both age and name, but then it'll error when we're trying to set it. It says object doesn't support this property or name when we're trying to assign it. So one immediate thing that's cool about this is you can actually create things that you can get from your class, but that you can't assign. All right, so let's be able to assign these items. So it's going to be very similar. I'm going to just duplicate both of these, like so. But instead of get, I'm going to call it let. So we're going to let this name be something. So what do we want the name to be? Well, in this case, we're going to pass in the new name. So let's just call it new name here. And then we need to assign this new name to the internal version of our variable so that we can use it within the class, and then so that also when they call the get property, it'll return it properly. So what we're going to do now is basically switch this around like so. So when we assign the name to a new name, we're going to assign the internal property to my new name, such that when I get the name, it returns that new name that's been updated. So this will make a little more sense in just a second, but again, just kind of switching these things around. This will be let. We'll pass in a new age, like so. All right, so look at how much code this is, and we really didn't change anything before when we just had public, but I'll go ahead and run this just so we can see it's nothing, age is nothing, and then we assign it, and now name has something and age has something. All right, so we're kind of back to where we started. I'll go ahead and remove person 2. We'll just work with one person for now. We're back where we started. So what was the point of all this? Well, again, it's because you can put restrictions now on your gets as well as your sets. So the first restriction we talked about was we shouldn't be able to assign this negative number here. So let's fix that. Let's say, hey, if the new age they pass in, that should be greater than 0. Right? You know what? It also should be less than 150. Maybe we don't want people to live that long, right? And so now my age property, this private property up here, it won't update unless it passes this test. So now, back here, when I assign it to -15, and I run this again, so here's our name, here our age is nothing, then we assign Jake, and then we assign the age, but it's still empty. And that's because this didn't go through, because we have these restrictions. And if you wanted, you could even put specific messages or whatever you wanted to do in here, saying, hey, you know, invalid age, and you could say it has to be within 0 and 150, you know, valid range 1 to 149, I guess this would be, right? So now when you try to do this, and let me simplify this. We're just working with age right now, so I'm just going to comment out the non-age related stuff. So now you can see we have nothing when we first print it out. Then we try to assign it, and it says, hey, you have an invalid age here. This is the valid range. And when we print it out again, it's still empty because it didn't allow it to assign it. However, let's do this again. Let's assign it good age. So we'll say here, just duplicate this, say 23, for example. So I'll assign an age of 23. I'll print it out. And then I'll try to assign -15 and I'll print it out. And we'll see what happens. So 23 worked. I assigned it and I printed it out. It's printed out 23. But then I get my invalid age. And when I click OK, notice that it's still 23. It doesn't change to 15. And that's the beauty of properties, is you can put restrictions on things. Now, in some cases, you don't need any restrictions. So you could technically just keep this as public and call it name, you know, if you didn't have any restrictions. But the convention is for class variables to always just make them private. Obviously, there's cases where you don't need to do this, but the convention is go ahead and just make them private. And if you don't have a restriction, create a get and a let property for it and just don't put any restrictions on it. By doing that, later on, it allows you to change it and update to add some restrictions to this because it's already in place. But it's up to you. Okay, let's also talk about the fact that a property allows you to separate the get and the set piece of things. So you can basically make something read-only. For example, with age. maybe I don't want them to assign age at all. Maybe I want my code to do that. And so this would be invalid. So to do that, we'd probably have to assign the age internally now. So how do we do that? Well, we'd probably assign these things internally when the class is first created. For example, when we first create a person, we'd probably create them at age 0 or age 1, and then we would increment that. So let's do that. So there's a special subroutine to do that. So we're going to create a private sub. You can also make this public if you want to be able to call this multiple times, but generally it's private. It's called class initialize and sub. And what this does, we'll say new person created. Basically, this is called every time your person is created. So if I create a new person, maybe I'll make person 2, create another person. Watch what happens. I'll double click this and notice I get this message called new person created. And I click it again and I get, hey, another person was created for this message here. And then I get my other message boxes. So class initialize is a special subroutine that's called anytime you do new. And so this would be a perfect place to set up our items. So instead of having a blank name when we first start things, let's put it as unknown. And then their age can start at 0, for example. So now, when I first message box out the name, for example, and the age, notice we'll actually have some values here. So I'll double click this, and the name will be unknown before it was empty. And then the age is now 0, and before it was empty. And when we try to assign a different age to it that's invalid, the age stays the same at 0. So now we're able to set up our variables internally. This is also the same if you had a public one. So you had a public name, for example. You can't just do equals new name here because public is similar to dim. So you can't do dim name equals that. You have to actually assign this in a different statement like so. And you do that inside of your initialize method. This is called a constructor. It's what's called when you're constructing a new object. So even if you have public ones, this is where you set those items up. Okay, so we've done that. So now instead of being able to set like so, I'm actually going to get rid of that. So now they're not able to assign it. When we run this, notice we just get an error that says, hey, you can't assign age. That property is not allowed. I could get it, as you saw, but I couldn't assign it. But I want to be able to update it the way that my specific case needs, and I'll use a subroutine for that. So let's create a routine. This one will be public. We'll call it birthday, or has birthday, or had birthday, right? I'll just call it birthday to keep this simple. And sub, and in here, I want to take my internal age, I want to get the existing value, and I want to add 1 to it. So every time we have a birthday, we can add 1. And you can even add restrictions in here saying, hey, if the internal age gets greater than 150, don't allow the incrementing anymore. Maybe make this person go into dead mode, or if this is a game, for example, you could have a private variable where it's the person's age, max age, for example, and then you could randomize what their max age is and then check to see if they've reached their max age and stop assigning a new age to it, whatever you want it to do. But now, instead of doing .age, we'll call our birthday method. So now when I run this, notice we get 0 for the first age message box, and then the next one, they are now 1. And if I call this multiple times, let me just comment out that. Now they start at 0, and they'll have 3 birthdays, and now they're 3. We could do similar things for the name. For example, maybe we wanted to have a first and last name rather than just a name. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this item. for simplicity's sake. And then I want to be able to get both the first and last name. So let's duplicate this and we'll call it first name. So their first name will be assigned to the internal first name, right? Getting back this field. And then we want one for the last name as well. So we want to be able to get the last name. So last name here, and then this we called L, right? So now we can get the first and last name. And I want to be able to set these two, right? So let's go down to name, and instead of being able to set the full name, let's be able to just set the first and last name. So we'll change this to first. Again, this will be our internal first name property equals the new name, and we'll copy this, and we'll call this last name. And this will be last name. And you could change this to be, these can be whatever you want, right? So name first or first name, etc., as long as the names don't conflict. So now down here, I can do first name, I can do last name, I'll call it Knowles, and I can print those out. Let's print out and person one last name here. I guess we should put a space in between here or something. We'll just put a line feed. So now we get Jake Knowles. It would be cool though if our code could get the full name for us. So we already have this name variable. We might as well use it. So instead of assigning it here, I'm going to be able to get the name, and it'll be a combination of our first and last name. So F name and space last name. Just like that. So now I can get a name property, and we could call this full name if you wanted. Right? You could rename this to full name just like that. But for now, we'll just leave it at name. And what it does is it allows you to get the first name with a space and then the last name. And we've already gotten rid of the let property for the name. So we're not allowed to assign name anymore like this. We can't do that, but we can do a message box of it, and it will combine the first and last name for us. So now we can just put name here, and it will combine our first and last name for us like so. And if we want, we can still, get our first name only or our last name only, just like that. But you can see the cool restrictions we can do by using properties. Properties let us set and get variables, but put extra things on them, put restrictions on them, and that's the whole point. So we've talked about how you can have subroutines. You can also have functions. Public function. We could say is adult, for example, would be a function, an end function, and all that would be is adult equals if their age is greater than or equal to 18, right? So this is just going to return true or false. Here we're assigning that to is adult, and it's a function, so you could also change it based with a message box, right? You could say, hey, if person one is an adult, then do something, We could say, hey, this person's adult, so let them in the club, else, like that. So we can have functions, and what's cool is those functions can use things within your class, like the age. So we'll run this, say let them in the club because they're an adult, whereas if their age was below 18, like so, hey, they're not allowed in the club. And just to give a cool example, we could set them to 17, and we can print this, we can run this, but then we can have a birthday, person one, so have birthday. I think have birthday would be a better name for that function. So we can just rename that. And then I'll copy this again. So hey, check if they're an adult, have a birthday, check if they're an adult again. So when we run this at first, it says, hey, they're not allowed in the club. Then we'll have a birthday, and now look, let them in. So that's functions. So let's talk about also, we should talk about being able to assign objects to properties. So right now we've just dealt with simple variables like ages and strings and stuff like that. But if you wanted to assign another object to a field property, then we would have to have a special way of doing that. So let's talk about that. Let's say this person has a vehicle. So I'll create a vehicle that the person can have, and I'm going to then allow them to set that. We should probably allow them to get it too in this case. So let's copy the first name as an example. Let's just go down to the bottom here, and we'll first create our get. We can call this vehicle like so, and this will return. So our vehicle is going to equal our internal vehicle name. And then I'll create a let for it, just like we're used to. So when we let it, we're going to assign basically a new vehicle to this, like so. Let's flip this around. Okay. All right, so here's our standard way of doing it, but this is going to be an object, just like our person is. So let's go ahead and create a new vehicle class. I'm just going to call it car in class. And to keep things simple, I'll just have a public variable. We'll call it maybe the model or the manufacturer. You can have all that stuff here. I'm just going to put name to keep this simple, and just create a new car. So like that. And then I want to assign person one's vehicle to equal that car, like so. So what's wrong with doing it like this? Well, car is an object. It's not just like a single item like their name. It actually has multiple things. It has a name right now. We could also have other things like how old the car is, what the model is of the car, etc. So when I run this and I try to do it, notice I just get an error that says, that's not supported. Object doesn't support the property in vehicle. The reason for that, of course, is because new vehicle coming in is actually an object. It's not just a single item. So instead of using property let for a single thing, we're using set for something that represents a group of things, right? An object instance. And so because we use set, of course, we have to use it internally too anytime we use our method. So set this object. Same for over here, making this variable equal to whatever this is pointed to. So again, we use set. Anytime you're assigning using the equal sign with objects, you have to use the word set. So now we might think we're done, but again, using the word equal sign, but we're assigning an object, this new car, to the vehicle, and we need the word set here. So up here we don't need the word set because this is a single item, but car is an object. So now everything works, and if I want to, I can get person one's vehicle, and then in that get the name of the vehicle, like that, or whatever other variables we had here. And we can go ahead and assign this to something, by the way. Let's grab our initializer and just set this up really quick to actually have something on it. We'll say this is a 300ZX. So there we go. Now we can print out the name of the car by doing vehicle. And notice I have a second dot because person one dot vehicle returns the car as one object, and now I can assign any of the methods, the classes, etc. on my car. So if I wanted to have something called, drive, and then I could have number of miles, like 23 miles, and then inside here I would have a function to do that. So sub drive num miles and sub, and then you could do your calculation. Say you have something that calculates how much gas you have, and your number of miles would decrease from that gas. So maybe you have a private member for gas miles, and when you first create a car, it's at full tank, so maybe we have 100 miles. So what you do is say, okay, mgas miles equals however many gas miles you had minus the number of miles you drove. And you would also want to put things on here like if statements saying, hey, if you're out of gas, then you can't run this many miles. And it will decrease the gas miles on just that car. But if I create another car, if I have car 2 here, that one has a full tank of gas even after I've driven the car. So if I just move this here, for example, I'm just gonna remove this for simplicity's sake. Car 1, and I drive 23 miles. We can print out miles left, I guess. Let's create a property called miles available, and property, and miles available will just equal our internal gas miles that we have, right? So I'll drive 23 miles, and I'll message box out car 1's miles available, and then I will message box out car 2. You can see it'll be a full tank of gas. So run this, and we get 77 miles available for car 1, but I have 100 miles for car 2. And that's because all of the things inside the class get created for each instance, for each new object that I create. All right, what else do we have to talk about for classes? I guess there's a couple additional interesting things. For example, when you're done with your class, there's actually a private method called terminate. For example, let's do that to the car actually. So it's called class underscore terminate, and this gets called when your class goes out of scope. And so I'll create 2 cars. Let me get rid of the message boxes here, and I'll just have a message box called done. So I'll run this, and you can see I get a message box done, and I'm at the end of my code. When I click OK, notice I get another message box out of nowhere that says, hey, car no longer used. And the second one says car no longer used for car 2. So that's coming because I've exited out of the current scope I'm in. If you were in a function, this would also apply. For example, I'll show you that here. I'll make a test sub that creates a new car within that, and I'll say car 2 name, for example, and sub. So I'll say message box done here. I'm also going to call test. So this will run this method, right? And let me do it before car 1 just to really show this example. I'll call it here. Okay. So I'll call test here, create, and then I'll hit done. So when I run this, I get my message box, my name, which is car 2, because I've called test, I've created a car, I've message boxed out the name, and now I'm going to create car 1. But notice as soon as I hit OK, it says car no longer used, and it's talking about car 2 here, because as soon as I exit out of this test sub, this variable, car 2, is out of scope. It's no longer used. Like I can't use car 2 down here because I declared it within my sub inside of this. So it's basically destroyed after I exit the sub. And then I call done. So here's car 1. here, da, 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 and then when I'm done with that, when I exit the script, that also exits the scope for being able to use car1 anymore. And so that's why after this script is done, I get car no longer used for car1. So if it's in a sub, it will automatically call the terminate method when you stop being able to use car2. When you're no longer able to use car2, it will call this method. Or if your script finishes, then all of the variables that you declared within that script will also be terminated, and it will call that method. You know, what can you do, or why would you want this? Well, if you're like reading to a file or something, for example, maybe you created a class that's a helper method for creating a log file. So class logger and class. And in here you had like, you know, you had some methods. So public sub write log and sub write. And basically you had a private variable for your log file, your stream. So this is your log file. And when you first create this class, you want to initialize it. Here we go. You want to open up your log. So I'll just have a FSO. I have other videos talking about this, but basically then I'll open a text file. So now when I do write log and I say, well, I want to write this message. Well, now I can do my log file dot write line message. So let's just do this. So I'm doing all of this to showcase the terminate method and a proper way to use that. So I'm going to create a new logger. So I'll say log, we'll do set log equals to my new logger, log dot write, I think I called it write log, test this out. So I'll just write that to my log file. So here's my function to test this out. I'll double click this. And look, it created a log file. And if I open that, it has my message in it. But when I'm using this log file, I have this text file open. And so when I'm done with my logger, like when my script ends, I want it to close the log file in the background, so I don't keep that open and cause memory leaks and stuff. We're just going to duplicate the initialize method and call it the terminate one. And this one again gets called like we saw with our core example. It gets called when the class is done with. And all we're going to do is say, hey, my log file that I have opened, close it, right? And that way we just make sure that we're not keeping that stuff open in the background at all. So now nothing changes, of course. I can go ahead and delete this and rerun it, and it will create a log file just like it did before and have the same information in it. But we're being smart about things, and we're closing up our file when we're done using it. And again, I have videos talking about how to write to text files and stuff that go more into that, but the idea is you can use your class terminate to clean up any of your code. Now, again, variables declared within the script scope go out of range when the script ends, but maybe you're done with your logger here. You're already done with it, and you have more code down here that doesn't need logger, right? Well, I don't want my logger to remain open past this line, right? I don't want it to still be open down here. So what I can do is destroy the log method. And you do that with set, just like before. And you set your log equal to nothing. And what that does is just destroy this object so you can no longer use it. So if I tried to do this after I've already set it to nothing, then it wouldn't work. But assigning it to nothing will also call my terminate method so that it can properly close out of my code. So this is a way to destroy your objects. You can do this with the person one, and the car and all that stuff. And if you need to get rid of them before your whole script ends, then that would be a way to do it, is assigning it to nothing. You can also check to see if it is nothing before assigning it to nothing if you wanted, or to see if it still exists. For example, again, like say we had a log message down here, this would no longer work. So I'm going to go ahead and run this, and more code that doesn't need a logger. Then I hit OK, and we get an error that says, hey, object required. It's talking about this object doesn't exist anymore because we assigned it to nothing. So if you want to first check to see if it exists, you can use is. So we can say log is nothing, then can't do it. Else we can still write to the log. So you could put something if you wanted a message box, or if you wanted to say if not is nothing, right? Then we can log it out. So if this still contains an object, then you can write this. Otherwise, don't do anything. So now we don't get an error anymore because we've checked to see if it is nothing. So you don't use equals because you're not assigning it to nothing. You're checking to see if it is nothing. And we use is when dealing with objects. We use equals when dealing with simple variables like age and strings and stuff like that. All right, I think we've gone pretty exhaustively over this in terms of an introduction anyways. There's a few other methods, but as a basic introduction of functions, of subs, of properties, of gets, of set properties, of let properties, that covers what classes help you do. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.